All right, so I just pushed the button, so we're going to record it from here on out. So basically, today we're going to get into um, pretty much just the beginnings. You know, the what reconnaissance is, how it works, how we go about doing it, why we do it, and that type of thing. So we'll get into that. We'll also look at scanning and enumeration. We'll get some time with Nmap and some other tools, and we'll spend about 45, 50 minutes just looking at reconnaissance, and then we'll give you like a 5 minute water, bathroom break, whatever. We'll come back. We'll spend the second hour on scanning and enumeration. I'll get into Nmap and some other tools to just kind of show you how we use these things. Because you can go and watch videos all day on YouTube on what Nmap is, how Nmap works, but to see it actually being used in a real pen test scenario is something quite different. And that's what our focus is going to be as we get ready to do this here. So I am going to take over the screen sharing responsibilities here. And kind of guide you through these things. So you did make me the host, right, Saif? You're muted. We got somebody else
Yes,
joining in.
yes.
All right, cool. So the first thing we'll talk about is reconnaissance and all the different information that we can find out there. Now to start with, I will be using Kali Linux, as the platform that I'll be using to walk through and demonstrate these things to you. All right. So when we talk about passive reconnaissance, what that really means is you are identifying things about your target, and you're doing it in such a way that it makes it difficult or impossible for the victim to know that you're doing whatever that activity is. For example, if I were to go out and pick a target, let's just say we're looking for classified information, passwords, and things like that. So if I went out to Google and I just did a search for something like this, and let's say I wanted to only look for Excel documents. Well, this is not something like, for example, if I find these documents for DOD or for the White House or for any intelligence organization, they're not necessarily going to easily know that I'm doing this because I'm not interacting directly with the target. And that's one of the primary criteria that you look for, is the fact that you're not interacting with the target. Okay. Now, basically, what we have, you can see here with that link, we get about 1,600 results back. If I change this file type to just Word document, for example, you can see the results jump up to 12,000 from 1,600. If I change it to an even more file format like PDF, it goes from 12,000 to almost 7 million results here. And some of these do end in .mil, .gov, so forth and so on. And I would bet you that about half these documents are harmless, but I can guarantee you that some of them should absolutely not be browsable from Google, and they are. Okay, so this is one example of passive. Another example of passive is if I were to go out, and I'll use an old president here. So I'm going to just search for um, Dick Cheney, who used to be the Vice President of the United States. Now, I want to point something out here. When we look at this document, and this again, this is passive recon. We're searching in public here. Okay, that one's gone. So when we look at this information, this screenshot, this aerial photo of his house, in the U.S. here, we have something called plat of subdivision. So if you buy a piece of property or a piece of land, you have to register that purchase and the ownership of that land with the county that you live in. And this information is publicly searchable. So when we go and look at this property, one of the things that Bay people key on it is when you go and look at any lot in these plats of these different counties in the U.S., there's always a name. It's by law that the person's name has to be associated with it. The only way you can get name withheld by request is you have to have some type of diplomatic power or diplomatic immunity. So just seeing that tells you that this is an important piece of property, or it's the property of an important person, because it's very hard to get that type of situation where you can keep your name off of it. But it's at 1126 Chambridge Road. But what gives it away is when you look at the mailing address. In other words, where do you want your correspondence about this property mailed to? They put the address here, and let me see if I can use the marking tool. The address that they put here is the actual vice president's address. So in the US, when you're elected vice president, this is where you live. You live at what we call the Naval Observatory. That's your residence. And the fact that they put this as a mailing address made it clear to anyone that's paying attention exactly whose particular house or whose lot this is. So that kind of gave it away. But these people went out there. They didn't stop there. They went and logged and paid attention to other things. For example, they went to Google Earth, did an aerial of the lot before the house was built, and then they set up shop out there and started taking photos and video of when his house was being constructed. So all kinds of information they got, like we took the license plate here of this car, did a reverse lookup on it and found that it was this architect's firm. So then from a passive recon standpoint, how hard do you think it would be to go out and get floor plans from this architect's firm? Because in the world of cybersecurity, things like architects firms, engineering firms, construction companies, they have some of the absolute worst cybersecurity of anyone out there. So getting into this organization, getting those plans wouldn't be that hard. There's also the general contractor or the builders that actually built the house. We got that information, and we can also see, other things about what's going on. Now, I want you to pay attention to something specific here. Let's go back to the top. These documents showed up on the internet in February 2008. Obama administration didn't come into office they didn't get elected until November 2008. So what this tells you is that this information was out here while this person was still the sitting vice president of the United States. So the reason I always kind of intro with this is to show you that no matter how protected you think you are, because the president and the vice president, I can tell you for certain, are the two most protected people in this country, maybe in the world. But even with those people, it was a matter of knowing where to look on the internet to passively get an actual floor plan of his house. Now, to show you I'm not exaggerating about the fact that it's actual floor plans, when we look at part 2, which showed up in April 2008, what we actually have is suddenly this sign showed up that said, protected by national security. So if we had any doubts as far as who we thought it was, now we know it was, it's somebody that's protected by national security. But as we get to the end here, what we find is that there's all of this extra protection, like these are really expensive surveillance cameras, and here's a motion detector right here with another camera. And all they counted about 16 of these around that property. That's a lot of surveillance for just a residential house, okay? But what really takes the cake is if you look at the end here, what we can actually see are actual floor plans of Dick Cheney's house. And they were able to do this because they had a really good camera that they were using from across the street, and they were able to had a telescopic lens on it, and they were able to zoom into this construction shed and take pictures of the floor plans through the window. Give me 30 seconds in Photoshop and I can have you a clean, pristine, clear set of floor plans just by doing some filtering and stuff like that. So that just goes to show you, when it comes to passive, there is literally no limit to who's vulnerable. And no matter how much protection an organization thinks they got, you're vulnerable. I'm going to put this link in chat, so if you all want to take a look at it, you have the ability to do that. And it's a real link. I'm not showing you something that's pre-set up. This is really out there. Now, what if you're targeting someone that's not famous? Well, there's something called the Google Hacking Database that we all use in the industry, specifically for that. And of course, I got to do the little "I'm not a robot" thing. So with this Google Hacking Database, I'll definitely provide you the link to that as well. And I'm going to try to do most of these sessions just within Kali here. That way, if you go and download Kali Linux, you should theoretically be able to go back and do everything that I show you with your own Kali Linux desktop. So I'm going to try to not use any customer special tools so that you can go back in your own time and reproduce everything that I demonstrate to you. People tend to get a lot of value out of that. So on this Google Hacking Database, what we're going to do is I'm going to look specifically for passwords. So let's find the passwords dork here. We're looking for pages containing passwords. And that's all you're doing, is you're just searching for that. So there we go, files containing passwords. So I clicked that and it automatically sorted this list by those. I want to show you some very specific ones and show you just how easily we can find this information out here. Now what this is it's a collection of Google search strings that the hacker community as a collective have put together to give us a place, almost of a database, that we can go, and if we want to look for certain types of information that's leaked, we can do these queries without having to go and look up or figure out how to do the query specifically. And the reason I want to show you this, and you have to be really careful, because I've had some customers that I showed this to and they went out and found their own information out here. So, you know, be mindful of that. All right, so the first one I want to show you is this is XAMPP, which is a front end for MySQL. So it's showing you that if you want to look for XAMPP passwords that are in the wrong place, use this search. So I click it, it takes me right out. I can go and put that right into Google, and these are actual XAMPP results that we're getting here, right? That's an actual username and password. That's it, that's simple. Now, I'll show you one that's a little more disturbing. And you could spend, let me just tell you, you could literally waste entire weekends, spend entire weekends, nothing but searching through these Google dorks here and finding all the different leaked information, passwords, password hashes, and things like that. But with this Yahoo site admin one here, I want to show you this Dns Insurance. Now there's many in here. As you can see, there's quite a few results. But if we look at this Dns Insurance, all right, and I open this db.conf file, this is an actual username and an actual password to that website. So if you wanted, you could log into this site as admin right now, because that's a site admin credential. you could log in with that username and that password and completely take control of that site. Now, when we look at the site, somebody might say, well, is that a legitimate company? Well, let's go see who they are. When we look at their website, we find out that they are a legitimate insurance firm in Columbus, Ohio. This is kind of in the center of the U.S. They provide insurance. They also provide financial planning and some other stuff. So they are a legit company. They do have legit clients. If you look at their client list, they have some pretty impressive people in Columbus, Ohio that they're claiming to represent or to provide insurance or financial planning for. So this is significant, and we're doing this. We're able to do this or find this information at least without communicating with them at all, because how we found it was out here, right? In other words, we don't have to interact with that target directly. Here's another one, Heartland Reps. Don't know who they are, but we can own that site too, because there's their credentials. And this is all passive. This is all stuff that's just out there. All right. So the whole concept of passive reconnaissance, the whole concept of being able to look up information passively is definitely a real thing. And it's something that we spend a lot of time doing in the world of hacking. Okay. Because if you do a good job of passive recon, when you get to actually doing active recon, which is what we're going to be doing after our first break, where we're doing scanning and interacting with the target, that stuff becomes a lot more surgical, and you don't have to be as noisy and leave behind such a big footprint. And one big part of doing scanning and enumeration, there's always an effort to try to be what we call stealthy, which means you want to try to be as quiet as you possibly can. Okay, and I'm going to show you some techniques that we utilize for that. Now, all of these things that I'm showing you, we're scratching the surface of how deeply we go into it in the official ethical hacking courses. You know, for each one of these topics that you will get an hour or so on, you generally spend almost an entire day diving into, you know, that specific topic in one way or another. Now, with this content here, this is one thing, but some other things you can get into, and you definitely might you know, get the title of being a little creepy. But if I do this right here, what this shows me are publicly accessible webcams that are not properly protected. So this right here, this is a live security camera at a place called Blanton Bottling, who apparently they bottle for Buffalo Trace, which is, I believe, a liquor from Jack Daniels, I think. Some of you whiskey connoisseurs, you can tell me who Buffalo Trace is. I believe it's got something to do with whiskey. But we can see the camera. Not only that, we can control it. So if I wanted to like go up, for example, I could push up and then I could zoom the camera up. If I want to go to the right, I could just say pan right, and it pans right. If I want to pan left, I go pan left, and it pans left. Now notice I've not entered a username, a password, or anything to do this. What's really scary, if you start adding keywords like airport and some other things, you start to get to some really, really scary stuff. You know, for example, we actually found one of these cameras that was pointing at a secure part of an airport back on the back end that we absolutely shouldn't have been able to look at. Because what this is, that query specifically is for a high-end type of webcam or security camera called Axis. And they are rapidly replacing what we know as closed circuit TV or CCTV with these very high-end security cameras here. And it's great because now you don't have to have physical cable ran. You can have many cameras in one interface where you don't have to have all this hardware that you had to have with CCTV. This is a much better solution from just an operations and logistics standpoint. And what's happening as a result of that is you have these physical security experts that don't really know anything about IP security, or maybe not even know what an IP address is, because they're physical security experts. They're now being tasked with putting in these IP cameras, and they're literally just following what's on the instructions and just plugging these things in, connecting them to the network, and leaving it set. So that's why you see a lot of this stuff popping up out there now, whereas it wasn't so prevalent in the past. Okay. So this is also something that we do a lot of as far as looking at these. Now, like I said, you might get the title of Creepy Person of the Year if you tell somebody, yeah, I spend all my weekends spying on people's webcams. That may not be a good social move for you, to say that. But as a hacker and as a security researcher, this is something that's important to do and look at. Now, one other thing I want to show you is this is Axis, but there's other web cameras. For example, I can do camera linksys in URL main.cgi if I wanted to look for Linksys cameras. And these are all specific Linksys webcams. And I may not be able to look at them in my Kali here because most of these want specific plugins in your browser. And I've just kept this browser pretty locked down to where I don't have them, so I'm not going to install any if it doesn't allow us to view it. I might just go out to my host to do it. So same business, you end up with a live camera feed and you can control the camera, but this time it's a Linksys brand camera. And I could show you a different one for Sony cameras, a different, for every camera brand that's out there, there's a different query that I could show you to go and, find this information for those specific cameras. And that's what that boils down to. So that's all passive information. This is all information that you can get without interacting directly with the target. Now that's all stuff on the internet using browsers. So now I want to show you a few command line things before we take our break here. And one of the big ones is whois. All right. Now whois allows you to query, and we didn't really do any recon on any of you that are attending this webinar, this session. So I don't know who has what background. So I'm keeping it kind of basic, but also showing you the advanced application of it. But so whois is a public database that keeps track of domain and IP registration information. For example, I'm going to use Mississippi State as a target. This is a university. And when I put them in as a target, you can see that it gives me back some information about their domain registration. I can see the registrant. I can see who their contacts are, administrative contact, technical contact, got them all there. And then we can also see what their authoritative name servers are right there as well. All right. Now, one of the things that we teach you in the course is you spend a significant amount of time, a few hours, learning just basic Linux command line, because to do all these things that I'm going into, you have to get yourself a little acclimated with the Linux command line. So for example, if I were doing a big company like Microsoft, the whois information could be much larger. There could be much more of it, right? We ran out of space essentially. So there could be hundreds of pages or thousands of pages of this, which means now you need to be able to do something like grep. So for example, I'm going to do whois ms state again, but this time I'm going to say only show me or grep for things with @ in it. And it shows me just the associated email addresses. Or if I wanted to find what their authoritative DNS servers were, I could say grep for name server. Right? And that shows me that's the tag, but I want to get the information after it. So I would be teaching you like, hey, with grep, if you want to say grab that string plus 10 strings after it, I would teach you that like we do a -A for after and then the number 10. So it's not about just learning hacking. You also have to learn the operating systems and the idiosyncrasies of that as well. And we kind of blend that into the training. So as we can see here, now we got not only that string like we did the first time, but we also got 10 lines after it, which includes the actual DNS server information. Okay. Now, speaking of DNS and DNS server information, DNS is one place where you can get a lot of useful information about a target. For example, I'll take the same target. We're just going to use a tool called Dns Recon. And it shows us some basic DNS information about that domain. So I'm just going to take this first IP right here. And I'm going to make an assumption and say, you know what? If Mississippi State owns that one IP, they probably own this entire Class C range all the way up to 254, from 1 to 254. So let's do what we call a reverse lookup here and see if that's true. Now again, not knowing what everybody's background is, let me explain what a reverse lookup is. When you put into your computer browser, google.com or facebook.com or twitter.com, and you hit enter, what actually happens is your computer uses something called a DNS resolver service to send a message to whatever you have configured as your DNS server on the network or in the world, and it will ask that DNS server, hey, what's the IP address for Facebook? And then that DNS server will respond to you and say, oh, the IP address for Facebook is this. And then your browser actually goes to that IP address. That's called the Dns Ford Lookup. And this happens every time you visit a website. So we all use it. And we also use it internally. Well, that's a forward lookup. We say, here's the domain I want to go to. What's its address? What's its IP address? Well, what do you think it's called if we say, here's an IP address? What's the host name associated with that? That's a reverse lookup. It's doing the opposite. So what I'm instructing Dns Recon to do here is for all these IPs, do a reverse lookup and tell me what fully qualified domain name they resolve to. And when I do that, I get back some pretty useful information. And it shows me that, hey, it looks like Mississippi State indeed owns all those IPs because everything resolves to something that ends in msstate.edu, right? Now, the problem here is what it is with a lot of things. The problem here is basically that, again, we have all this data, whereas only a small chunk of it is actually useful, which would be the fully qualified domain name and IP. So again, how do we get just that information out? And if the answer you're thinking is put it into an Excel document and create a pivot table and all that, then that's the wrong answer. We're going to do everything from the command line here, all right? And you'll find that it's much faster. So I'm going to write this data to a file using that is greater than symbol. Looks like that. So then I'm going to clean it up by grepping just for this PTR string and take out all this stuff at the top and the garbage at the bottom. That looks good. So let's write that to a new file. And then from that, what I want to take out is just this field and this field. Now, if I set my delimiter or my separator as, let's pick the single quote here. That would make this over here field 1, this field 2, field 3, field 4, field 5, field 6, field 7, field 8. So if I say pull out for me field 8, I should get just that. And if that's field 8, then 9, 10, 11, 12 should be just the IP. So let's test that. Now it becomes, how do you in Linux tell it to pull just those fields out of a data set? Well, I'm going to choose to use something called awk. So I'm going to say from that file, pipe it to awk and print for me field 8. That's how we tell awk to print field 8. And it prints for us nothing. So that, it didn't like that, is what it boils down to. So let's try a different field. Let's try field 7. Well, that looks better. But the problem is I didn't specify this delimiter. So what's happening is awk is using space automatically. So I have to now give it a delimiter, and the way we do that is the following. I can say -F, like that, and then go back and give it field 8. And suddenly we get exactly what we want. And I purposely jacked that up. I purposely messed it up the first time because I wanted you to see the difference, because I know some of you, when you go practice this, you're going to get the wrong output because you're going to be missing certain features of the command. And I wanted you to see what that looked like. But when I went back and corrected it and added my delimiter, which is the single quote there, and in awk, this is how you say field delimiter, then printed field 8, it gave me the right info. Now I just need to check that field 12 is the other info that I need. So let's check that. It is. So then we know that field 8 and field 12 is what we need. Let's combine those. Just say field 8 comma field 12, like so. And now we got fully qualified domain name and its IP. So we got the information that we need. So now that we see on the screen that we've got the information that we need and it's formatted the right way, let's commit it to a file. And we'll just call this msstate targets. And there's our info. So now what we can do is we can start. Now keep in mind, we have not reached out and touched Mississippi State yet. So thus far, everything that we're doing is passive. So we haven't reached out and touched or given any indicator to the victim that we're doing these things yet. There's no indicator of that because this is all coming from public DNS records. Now, one of the things that we would do at this point is search through this for interesting devices. So for example, I noticed this is a college or a university. So I'm going to search through this for things related to that. I might search first for students. And I get nothing. So then I might say, okay, what about faculty? Oh, and I get a hit on that. So there are some devices in there named faculty credentials and test faculty credentials. Now, what do we know about test devices? In most networks, do you think test devices are as locked down as production devices? They're not. So I would bet I would probably have a better chance of breaking into this one than this one, but at least this one gets me on the network. Now, this also gives me another idea. Maybe I should look for test things because again, they're probably not going to be as locked down. So now I grep for test, and sure enough, I get a hit on several things that are named test or have the word test in it. And these would probably be good targets as we move on to later stuff. Right? Now, again, all this information that we've gotten passively, and we've not actually had to play our hand or give Mississippi State any idea that we are looking up information about them because this is coming from a public source. And this is what we mean by reconnaissance or passive reconnaissance. So what we're going to do, I'm going to let you take just a few minutes break here, and we're going to take this passive information that we've collected, and then we'll spend the next hour actually going through and interacting with these targets, these IPs, because now we're going to go from passive to scanning. And the way that I'll do that is I won't scan, like I'll scan Mississippi State a little bit because you can do it legally to some extent. But once we get to where we're actually getting ready to try to get information about the targets and things like that, I will be using some targets that I've set up and we'll pretend like they're Mississippi State because I'm not going to, go to jail for pen testing without a contract. So that's how we'll approach that. Any questions before I give you guys like a little short break here? All right, so let's take Phil's columns. Yes, Phil's columns the same. Yeah, if you want to call it that. So come back in 10 minutes and we'll pick up right here where we left off. As a matter of fact, I'll leave this up on the screen with the message for a little short break here. All right, let us get back started here. So we're kind of left off what we collected this information passively, and it got us to a point. Now, when we're looking at this data, some other important things to consider too is common names like, you know, things like Cisco, which is a popular vendor for networking equipment. And we can see here that we got, you know, these devices here that are also have the term backbone in it. So honestly, that would make me think that this is probably the backbone of a network or part of the backbone of a network. Because it says backbone, it's got Cisco in it, it's got management in it. So I'm thinking management interface or management plane, something like that from a networking standpoint. But notice there's something there called Allen, which we don't really have a good indicator as to what that is, right? So I might go out to the internet again to get help for that. So I'm just going to go to their website. And then on their website, I'm going to search for Allen. And what pops up is Allen Hall, right? So there's apparently a building named Allen Hall there. And if we go do some research on that building, what we find is it looks like that building houses IT. IT history, Office of the CIO, Enterprise Information Systems, Information Technology Infrastructure, User Services, IT Governance. All these things make me think that this building's probably houses IT, right? So suddenly the term Allen in our scan result makes sense, right? Now it makes sense why this says Allen, because Allen Hall is where their SOC and their NOC is, or the Network Operations Center is. Or at least that's what I would be guessing from this. So that gets us passive up to the point that now we need to start scanning to figure out what some of these things are. So remember we did this command right here to get us the IP and the fully qualified domain name. So now I'm going to create another file with just the IPs. And all I did was took the string out, the operator that said field 8 out, and that gave me just this list of IPs. Because now we're going to go active, and I'm going to take these IPs. I'm going to use a tool called Nmap, and I'm going to give Nmap that list of IPs and say, tell me which of those IPs respond to me. In other words, from the public internet here, how many of these devices am I able to actually reach? And we'll know that because we're going to send them a probe. And if we get a response back, we know we're able to reach it. If we don't, then we assume we can't reach it. Now, a couple things I want to point out about this. There is no magic to this. The way that I learned this, for example, you might say, well, Keatron, how would you know to do -IO and give it a list of IPs in a file? How did you know that? Well, the way I knew that is because at some point in my young career, I got introduced to Nmap like 20 years ago, and I did man Nmap, which is how you get help for some Linux utilities. So if you're ever on a Linux command line and there's a tool you're trying to use like cat, grep, whatever, just do man, whatever that thing is, and you may get a manual page that shows you information about how to use it. So if I do man Nmap, it gives me a help file for Nmap. Now, if you want to search through this page or through this man page, you can do a /. So if you look at the very bottom of my screen down here, I enter a / and then I search for whatever string I need help with. For example, I'm simply going to do, I'm going to search for input, right? Because we're trying to give an input. And when I do that, it clearly jumps me in the file to where it says, look, if you want to give nmap input, you have to use -il. Then you give it a file name, and that file has to have a list of hosts, which is another way of saying IPs. Okay, so that's how I would have learned to do that. And how did I learn to use the SN part, which is basically how you say do a ping scan or discovery scan in nmap? Well, the way I learned that's the same way. I said man nmap, and then I did a search for how do I do discovery scans. And it showed me here are a list of discovery scans right here. You can do SL for a list scan. You can do SN for a ping scan. And that looks more like what I want to be able to do right there. So that's where I would have learned these things. So when I do that, I could just let it show it to me on the screen like that, but that looks kind of a mess, right? I could output it to a file, but if I just did the is greater than, it's going to write to a file exactly what was on the screen. Well, as it turns out, nmap has its own output options. So again, how would I find out about that? Well, I did man nmap, and I did a / and I searched for output, and it says, look at, you can output normal mode, which is just going to put what's on the screen to file. We don't need that. You can do OX, which is going to give you an XML mode. So this would be useful if I were trying to have my results imported into a web form or a web application type program or something, you know, JSON or something like that. Don't need that. There's OS for script kiddie format. This is not useful. It simply does leet speak substitution, where it replaces the 3s with E's, the A's with ats, etc. Just to make it look kind of cool. Don't care about that. And then there's this last one, OG, which is output greppable. And what that means is it outputs the results into a form or a format that's easily grepped. And we already know we like grep, so I'm going to go for that one. So because of that, I'm going to say, yeah, output the results to a greppable file named msstateup, because I'm going to assume they're up because I can reach them because they can reach me. Right? Let me just do this. So what does that look like in comparison? Well, here's what it looks like on the screen, but let's see what our output file look like. So if we look at that, that's a lot cleaner than what we saw on the screen earlier, because we can clearly see IP and the status, which the only ones it shows us are the up ones. So out of the 254 IPs that we were discovering, all of the ones that we see here responded back to us, which means they are reachable from the internet. So they are valid targets now. Now, how many is it? Well, let's clean this up. So I'm going to grep for up first. So if I do this, that gives me just the data. And I want to know how many that is. So I'm going to introduce you to another command. Well, this is built-in Linux command line called a tool called word count. So I'm going to say pipe that to word count and count lines, which is what -l is in word count. And it tells me out of the 254 possibles, there are exactly 109 devices that I'm able to reach here, or that's reached back out to me, okay? And I know which ones they are because they're the ones that actually show up here. So now I want to see, well, what are these devices running, right? So I'm going to now need to extract just this field out, the IP field. Again, I'm going to simply use awk. So I'm going to put that to awk. Say print field 2 this time. I won't specify delimiter because I'm okay with it using space. And that gives me my 109 target IPs that I know I can reach. So I write those to a file. And now I got my target list to actually do more in-depth scans. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Nmap, look, let's scan that list. This time we're going to do a port scan, and we're going to see if any of these have port 443 open, and write the results to a greppable file for me named msstate SSL web, right? So what it's doing at this point is it's sending out a TCP packet with a SAN bit set to see if it can connect to port 443 on each of these IPs. Yeah, you would actually want to check for a lot of common ports. And yes, RDP is a good one. First actual contact, yes, this is our first actual contact. Well, actually the ping scan was our first actual contact. So now we got this list right here. But again, the screen's a mess. So what did we do? We wrote it to a file, right? We did this. So we're going to look at that msstate SSL web document there. And that's a lot cleaner. The only ones that we want are the ones that are open, because we don't care about filtered or closed. So I'm going to grep for open. And there's our list of devices that have something listening. There's some service on port 443 that's reachable from the web. Okay. Now, if I were going to go to the next step, I want to know what version of web is running there. Is it Apache? Is it Microsoft IIS? Is it IBM WebSphere? Like, what's the web service that's running on port 443 for each of these devices? Well, what that would look like is I would take this list, and from that I would awk out just the IPs, which is the smaller list now. That list, put that to a new file, call it SSL targets or something like that. And then I would scan that file for port 443 again, but this time I would do what we call a service interrogation scan or a version probe scan, which would look like that. Okay, and we'll let that scan run. Now I'm going to show you in a moment how Nmap actually does these scans, because I don't want you to just be running these scans without knowing what's happening under the hood. But it's basically checking now to see what version of a service is running there. Is it a web service, number one? And if it is, what version of it is it? Because you can't just say Microsoft IIS or Apache. Like, what version of Apache? What version of IIS? Because at that point, if you can get that information, then that sets you up to start looking for vulnerabilities for that specific service version, which would take us, into tomorrow's stuff. Okay, it all aligns, and you have to do it in the right order. And we're gonna dig deeper into Nmap and how it works here after this scan is finished. Or actually, we can kind of be moving in parallel here. So the thing I'm gonna do is we are gonna go ahead and hack the other one. But we're gonna pretend like another device. We're gonna use my internal network here, or my NATed network. We're gonna pretend like this network right here is also a part of the Mississippi State network. And we're doing just a discovery scan again. We'll call it the State 2 network. All right. So on the State 2's IP range, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 devices. Okay. So we wrote those to a file named State 2, which, as you know, looks better. It looks like that. This is a lot cleaner than this, right? So I'm going to grep for up again. And then awk for field 2. like so. Write that to a file. And then we can scan that file. And we can now do the scan that, who's that? Emperorman V was talking about there, looking for port 3389. Actually, by default, it's going to scan the 1,000 most commonly used ports across the entire range of 65,535 ports. So that's what it's doing here. Now, we'll come back to this, but let's go back to the first scan. This is the one against actual Mississippi State. And you can see we have different variations of services running there. For example, on this device, it's running Apache Tomcat version 8.5.33. And in tomorrow's session, we would be looking for vulnerabilities for that specific version of Apache. Further down the list, we see a newer version of Apache running here. And then we'll see yet a different, an even older version. Then we see an F5 load balancer running here. So there's different web services. There's some IIS and some other stuff that's running there. So we would be looking for later vulnerabilities for all those different versions of web services. Okay. Now, what Nmap did in this scan here is instead of checking all 65,535 ports, it just checked the 1,000 most common ports across that range. So I'm not saying it went from port 1 to 1,000. It has a definition file of the 1,000 most commonly used ports out of that 65,535 range. And by default, it scans those 1,000 ports. Now, how do you know that? Well, if you look at, for example, device 172 here, it says there is 985 closed ports, right? And if you count the ones that are open, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, there's 15. So 15 plus 985 is 1,000. Yes, it only scans for TCP by default because it clearly says TCP over here, right? If it were UDP, it'd say UDP. So it definitely only scans for TCP by default. As a matter of fact, you have to tell it to scan for UDP. If I wanted to scan for TCP and UDP, I would have to do something like this. So I'd have to do SU and SS, right? And that would tell it to do UDP ports, and then I have to specify a type of TCP scan, and in this case, I'm specifying a SYN stealth scan. So the results we get back from that will be common UDP ports and common TCP ports. But you know, that would lead us into another discussion about, you know, what does it mean when a UDP port comes back as open? Because it could mean something different. And I don't want to get too far into that and get us too far off topic here. And now that scan's running. So back over here to our results. That's how we know that it's scanning 1,000 ports. Now, if you want to scan a smaller subset of those, you have options. For example, we're going to focus on the device at 199 here, that device. So if I gave Nmap if I gave it the -F flag, it only scans 100 ports, because if you notice it says 81 closed now instead of like 900 and something, and if you count the ones that are open, it'll be 19, because if you add 19 to 81, you get 100. And that's because when you do the -F flag, it cuts it down to 100 ports, and that's an uppercase F. Lowercase f does something else. Okay. Or if I wanted to scan, you know, an even more specific number, I could do --top -ports and do like 75, and it only scans the top 75 ports. Yeah, Chandler, it's all recorded, so you can watch the recordings. And then we can see here that these are the ports that came back as open, you know, out of the 75 that we checked, right? Now, the question becomes then, how specifically, number one, how is Nmap finding that these ports are open? How is it determining that? And then number two, how is it determining services? Because I could scan port 80, for example, on the same device, and give it the SV flag, and it will actually tell me what the IIS version is. In this case, Microsoft IIS 8.5. So that's how I would know to go look for vulnerabilities and exploits for that version of IIS. But how is it doing that even, right? So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time doing, is making sure you understand how it's doing these things. And this, again, is the way that I teach the course. And this is why when people leave, they actually know what's going on. I'm not just able to run a bunch of tools. So what I'm going to do is go to that actual server. Not that one. And we are going to, I'll just continue to use Wireshark here. Do a new capture. Okay. And what we're going to do is I'm going to do a filter for my Kali server. Oh, actually, I don't think you all can see that, my Windows machine. So let me stop the share and reshare it with you here. All right. Can you all see my window screen now with the Wireshark thing up? We just need one person to confirm that. Yes, no, maybe? All right, yes.
Yes.
All right, thank you. And I'll do it between that machine and this one. Which is 194. Oh, I've got that twice. All right. So what I'm going to do is, why is it not letting me share my entire screen here? All right, so from the Linux side, I'll go back and just do it that way. I'm going to run this nmap command, and we're going to say port 80 to check and see if it's open. And it comes back and tells us that it's open. So now let's go look at the Windows side that was capturing that, and is also the one that we're scanning, to see what those scan results actually look like. And what you can see is the Kali Linux machine sent a TCP SYN packet, and the response that went back to the other side, you know, because just for visualization here, what we got going on is this machine sent the send packet this way, and then this machine responded back with a send and an ACK, which is the first part of a three-way handshake, which is a connection. So at that point, when Nmap received this send ACK back, it knows that port is open. So therefore, instead of breaking the law potentially and completing a connection, it actually sent a reset, which actually does not complete a connection. Therefore, you can't send this person to jail. And it actually closes that session before it ever completes. Because at this point, once the send ACK comes back, Nmap does not need to do a handshake completion, because at this point it already knows the port is open. So therefore, it's not necessary to follow the protocol and complete the connection. This is also a way that it maintains a little bit of stealth by not completing a connection. Now, if that's how it knows it's open, what happens if a port is closed? Well, port 81 is closed. So let's see what happens when we scan that. So I'll go back to our Kali machine, and we'll change the port to 81. And you see it comes back and it says it's closed as opposed to open that we saw for 80. And how it actually knew that is if we go look at the capture now on the Windows side, what we see is Nmap sent a send packet this time, right here to port 81, right? Because that's the port that we scanned. So that's going on right there. So it was to port 81, and then the victim or the Windows server this time sent back a reset. So it's just basic binary here. If Nmap sends a send and it gets back a send ACK, as was the case here, then it knows that port is open. But if Nmap sends a send and it gets back a reset, as it did here, Nmap knows that that port is closed. So that's the basic mechanics of how it determines whether a port is open or closed. And it's a very predictable, very reliable way to tell if a port is open or closed. Okay, so now you know how it determines that. But how does it determine service and version information? And to kind of give you an idea of that, we're going to use this FTP server here. And that server's got default information on it. It's running in default mode. So you can see it's a FileZilla FTP server. Well, if I come over, let's go back to our Kali Linux. And I tell Nmap to scan it. And the FTP server is listening on port 21, and I do a SV scan. We can see that it readily tells us like, hey, it's running FileZilla version, blah, 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 blah. So it knows, but how does it know? Well, fundamentally, there's always something called banners that comes out. So if we telnet it to port 21, there's a banner that jumps out and says, hey, I'm a FileZilla FTP server. So that's not that impressive that it can do that. But what if we change the banner, right? So let's go over here and mess with it a little bit. Let's change the banner on the victim. Go into our little FTP here. We're going to change the banner to say something other than FTP. We're going to make it say Cisco iOS version 15.1 or something like that. And we're also going to make it not listen on standard FTP port 21. Let's make it listen on port 500. Right? So now we've jacked up everything. So if we go and do the banner grab now, what do we see this time? Well, let's go check. So if I come over and I try to do my connection to port 21, it says can't connect. Why? Because if we scan port 21 on Nmap, Nmap will tell us that port is closed. That's because we no longer have that service over there listing on that port. That service is listing on port 500 now, which, by the way, Nmap tells us generally what's listing what port 500 is this ISACamp key management protocol that's used for Cisco VPNs. Now, what does the telnet tell us though? If we do a banner grab, even the banner alludes to it possibly being Cisco. So nothing about the banner. Oh, you guys are not seeing the catalyst screen? Yeah. Yeah, Saif, we need to figure out why it doesn't let me share the full screen here. Why I have to keep switching it. I don't like that at all. Where did it go? There we go. So when we do the Nmap scan for port 500, it tells us that it thinks that ISACamp is what usually runs there, and we know it's not. It's FTP. And when we do the banner grab, it says that it's Cisco iOS version 15.1. So everything to fool someone has been done. We call this forging a banner to lie about what it is, right? So then if the banner says it's Cisco and the port alludes to it being Cisco, what do you think is going to happen now if we do this? Because it, kind of said it thinks it's ISACamp. Do you think that when we do the SV scan right here, do you think it's going to get it right? And you can vote in chat. For those of you that think it's going to get it right, you can say right. For those that think it's going to get it wrong, you can say wrong. I got one right, two rights. Should make a wrong. Three rights make a right. Got it wrong, finally. And we'll wait and see. Well, we can't just say things like fingerprint, right, Sweeney? We have to talk. We have to talk in real terms here, not relative terms. So we have to actually see what fingerprint means, right? So it got it right. And the way it got it right is there's actually a file called a service definition file that Nmap has that has a little mapping of what every service that it knows about, how it should respond. And it went through a process of interrogation on that service to just see what was there. It wasn't doing like a simple fingerprint match. It was actually interrogating that service and seeing what it got back and then trying to match that up to something, right? So let's see what that looks like. I'm gonna go over, and I'm just gonna restart Wireshark. All right, and we're gonna do the scan again. But this time we're going to go and look at the traffic after it's finished, and I'll show you just how brilliantly it goes through and figures out what this actually is. it's going. All right, so it's finished, and as we see it got it right. So let's go back over and look and see on the Windows side what that actually looked like. Right? So clearly there's a lot of traffic. So let's look and see what it did step by step. So the very first thing Nmap did after it connected was look at this. It tried to figure out what was there. I'm just going to do a find because I know what it did. So I'm just going to kind of speed up the process and show you here. Very first thing it tried was an actual GET request. So what that is, when your web browser communicates with a web server, it usually does that in the form of a GET request. It says GET /HTTP, and then after that it'll do like it'll pull down the full page or pull down the header. But this is how you would talk to a web server. Well, why is Nmap trying to do a GET request here? Well, it's because it doesn't know what this thing is, right? And it's likely that it's a web server, at least in Nmap's mind, because when Nmap first was created back in the mid-90s, web servers made up 99% of the internet. So it was a good guess if you were scanning something on the internet back then, it was probably a web server. So that's why in its database and in its code, it's got an instruction that says, look, check to see if it's a web server first. Do that by doing a GET request, because at the time, literally every web server in the world answered to a GET request. Okay? But it didn't work. It came back and said error. Don't know what that is. Okay? So what did Nmap do? Well, it didn't give up on it being a web server. As a matter of fact, here's what it did. It then tried to do the HTTP options method. It went through all the HTTP methods or verbs, whatever you want to call them, to see how it responded. And of course, it says, I don't know what that is to all those. Eventually, Nmap gave up on it being a web server. And it said, well, what's the second most common thing on the internet? Well, back then, it was DNS servers. So it started to do DNS bind commands, Unix bind. Looks like that. So it ran this DNS bind command to basically ask the bind server, what version of bind are you? And it said, I don't know what you're asking me. So it tried a few more DNS bind commands, and it said, I don't know what you're asking me. The server did. So finally, Nmap even gave up on that. Here's what finally happened. After it tried a whole bunch of other things, Nmap finally just sent the command help, to which the server responded. So Nmap sent that, the help, and the server responded with this big list of commands, right? And Nmap mapped that list of commands to its database and said, okay, I recognize these commands as FTP commands, so I think this is an FTP server. And then it read this string and said, and also in my database, the only FTP server that responds with have a nice day is FileZilla. So because it's an FTP server and because it's responded with this in its banner or in its response banner, I believe this is a FileZilla FTP server. So it did all that, and that's how it came to the conclusion that the service that we're looking at is FileZilla FTP. That's how it knew, in other words. So it came to this conclusion based on all that. So the point being, it wasn't just doing a fingerprint match to, just one thing. It actually went through and interrogated that service, got it to give it feedback, and it took those pieces of feedback and mapped them to a services definition file. Okay, that's how it does its service identification. So even when you forward your banners and do things like that, you should know that those of us that know what we're doing, we're still going to figure out what it is, and we're going to eventually get into it if it's something that's got vulnerabilities that we can get past. Now, today we're not getting into the exploitation part. That'll be tomorrow. We'll take the information that we're gathering up to this point, and then we're using that information, or we will use that information to exploit some servers, get into them, and we'll get into moving horizontally and all that good stuff and putting backdoors. And there's some really scary rootkit stuff that I'll show you as well before we close out on Thursday with actual covering tracks and all that. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, or if anybody's got anything they want me to show related to the two topics from the day, or they have any questions or comments, we can allow time for that now. And we'll see where we are after we're done with that section. So shoot away with questions or comments if you have any. And you can say it audibly or in chat, doesn't matter to me. And if there is none, that means everybody completely understands everything I did, which is good. It means we're on the right track. All right, great. No questions. All right, Saif, do you have anything you want to add or say before we close it out here?
Thank you, Keatron. That was really a great walkthrough on the first two stages of a hack. I think this will be. We're really looking forward to the next two phases that we'll be looking at tomorrow. So everybody, please join us back tomorrow at the same time, and we look forward to seeing the next two phases of the hack.
Yeah, tomorrow's when we actually break into stuff. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, lots more questions then. But we try to set aside 15 minutes or so for questions at the end. But if you guys didn't have any, that's good. As we said, this session is being recorded. So Saif will make the recordings available to you. As a matter of fact, I should stop recording now.